My sister's mental health was the family's only emergency. Mine was managed with, "At least you're not as bad as her." Years later, I'm the one quietly in therapy, not for her, but for what being her sibling did to me. Posted to r/true off my chest. I want to begin with something that makes this story harder to tell than most hard stories. I love my sister. I love her specifically and completely, in the way you love someone you grew up alongside, someone whose particular laugh you would recognize in any crowd, someone whose history is so interwoven with your own that separating the two feels less like an untangling and more like a wound. I love her, and her illness is real, and the suffering it caused her was real, and nothing in what I am about to write is meant to diminish any of that. What I am about to write is about what happened to me in the shadow of that suffering. Not instead of it, not in competition with it, alongside it, in the space that was left over after everyone had attended to what they understood as the main event. I have been in therapy for 2 years. My therapist, Dr. Sandra Okafor, asked me in our third session to describe the primary thing I was carrying. I opened my mouth to talk about stress at work, or a relationship that had ended badly the previous year, or the general ambient difficulty of being a person in the world. And then something else came out entirely. I said, "I am angry at my sister for being sick." And I have never said that to anyone. Dr. Okafor did not flinch. She said, "Tell me about that." This is what I would have told her if I had known at the time how to tell it from the beginning. My name is Vivian. I am 36 years old. I have one sister, Camille, who is 33, and parents named Frank and Eleanor who are in their early 60s and who are, by every external measure, people who did their best. I believe they did their best. I need to say that at the outset, and mean it, because the story I am telling is not a story about malicious parents or deliberate neglect. It is a story about a family that was overwhelmed by one child's needs in a way that consumed the attention available for everything else, including the other child, and about what that does to a person across 20-some years of quietly adjusting to a smaller portion of care than she required. Camille started showing signs of serious mental illness when she was around 12. The diagnosis, which took several years and several wrong turns to arrive at, was bipolar disorder, type 1, the kind that presents with full manic episodes as well as depressive ones, the kind that at its worst is hospitalization level, the kind that is not a metaphor or a mood or a personality trait but a genuine, disruptive, at times dangerous alteration of consciousness. She has been hospitalized 3 times. She has been on medication continuously since she was 17. She has had periods of stability and periods of crisis, and the crises have been real and frightening and have required everything my parents had. I was 12 when the first serious signs appeared, 13 when the hospitalizations began, 15 when the diagnosis was finally confirmed, and the family reorganized itself around the new understanding of what we were dealing with. I was, during all of that, a child with my own needs. I say this now, as a 36-year-old woman in therapy, with a directness that would have felt impossible to me 10 years ago. I was a child with my own needs, and my needs were real, and they were not attended to in proportion to what they required. I want to be precise about what I mean by not attended to, because imprecision is the enemy of this particular story. I do not mean I was starved or neglected in any physical sense. I was fed and clothed and educated and present at birthday dinners, and there were Christmas mornings and family photographs and all the external evidence of a household that was functioning. What I mean is something that is harder to document and easier to dismiss, which is part of why it took me until I was 34 to sit in a therapist's office and say what I said. I mean that from the time I was 12 years old, the emotional resources of my family, the attention, the worry, the available bandwidth for responding to difficulty, were so consumed by my sister's illness that there was very little left over for me. And the portion that was left over was administered with a comparison always running underneath it, a comparison that I internalized so completely that I stopped bringing my own difficulties forward, not because I did not have them, but because I had been taught, slowly, and without anyone intending to teach me this, that my difficulties did not qualify. Here are some specific things. When I was 14, I told my mother I thought I was depressed. I had been feeling for several months a heaviness that I could not explain, a difficulty getting out of bed, a flatness to things that had previously given me pleasure, a sense that something was wrong that I could not locate more precisely. I told her this in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, which I remember because I had been building up to it for weeks and had chosen the moment carefully. My mother listened. She was not dismissive, not on the surface. What she said was, "I hear that you're struggling, honey. But I need you to understand that what Camille is going through is so much more serious. Can we talk more about this after I handle a few things this week?" The few things that week extended into the following weeks, and then the month after that, and eventually I stopped bringing it up because I had understood the lesson embedded in her response. My depression was comparative. It was evaluated against Camille's, and against Camille's mind did not register as something requiring action. I did not go to therapy at 14. I was not asked again how I was doing in that particular way. The heaviness eventually lifted, as teenage depression sometimes does, and I moved on, and the conversation was never revisited, and I grew up understanding, not consciously, not as a stated belief, but as a bone-level assumption, that my mental health was not a category that warranted concern. When I was 17 and preparing for college applications, I had a period of severe anxiety that I also did not name as such, but that I now understand clearly as an anxiety disorder presenting for the first time. My grades were unaffected, which meant it was invisible from the outside, and invisible from the outside meant there was no intervention. I was told I was stressed about applications. I was told all seniors were stressed about applications. I was told that Camille, who was 14 and in the middle of her second hospitalization, had real problems, and that in a few months I would be at college and could decompress. I went to college. I decompressed from one thing and began accumulating another, which is what happens when you push things down rather than processing them. In college, I was what people called high-functioning. I got good grades, I had friends, I involved myself in things, I was perceived as capable and together and fine. I was also, privately, struggling with anxiety at a level that was affecting my sleep and my ability to enjoy anything without an undercurrent of dread, and I told no one. I had been trained not to. When I came home for breaks, Camille's status was the dominant conversation. How was she doing? What the current medication combination was achieving? Whether the new therapist was a better fit? My parents asked about my grades, my activities, my friends, the external indicators of a person who was managing well, and I gave them the reports they were looking for, and we did not go deeper. There was not room to go deeper. The room was already occupied. I graduated. I got a job. I moved to a city 4 hours from home. I built a life that was, by all visible measures, successful and complete, and I did it carrying a set of things I had never put down, and had never been asked to put down, and did not fully know I was carrying. The comparison language was what did the most work, in retrospect. I want to stay with it for a moment because I think it is the mechanism through which a lot of well-intentioned families cause a specific kind of harm without understanding they're causing it. The comparison language worked like this. Whenever I expressed something difficult, stress, sadness, anxiety, disappointment, fear, it was received through the lens of Camille's experience. Not cruelly, not as a conscious diminishment, but as a kind of automatic calibration that placed my difficulty on a scale where Camille's diagnosis was the upper limit, and anything below that upper limit was therefore manageable, therefore not urgent, therefore something I could handle on my own. At least you're okay. At least you don't have what she has. At least you can function. You're so strong, Vivian. We don't worry about you the way we worry about her. You've always been the steady one. These sentences were said with love. I received them with love on the surface. Underneath the surface, I received them as a definition of my role in the family, the steady one. The one who does not require worry. The one for whom things are okay. And I became that role, the way children become the roles assigned to them, with a thoroughness that eventually made it impossible to distinguish the role from the self. The steady one does not bring her depression to the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon a second time. The steady one does not interrupt the family's focus on the genuine crisis to introduce her smaller one. The steady one manages. The steady one is fine. I was the steady one for 20 years. The unraveling happened slowly, and I want to be honest that it did not happen through a single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small recognitions, each of which I tried to dismiss, and eventually could not. The first recognition happened at a family dinner when I was 31. Camille was in a stable period. She has been largely in a stable period for several years now, which is something I want to name clearly because it is important and because her stability is real and hard one, and I do not want to tell this story in a way that minimizes it. She was stable, and we were having a genuinely nice dinner, and at some point my mother said something to me that she meant as a compliment. She said, I think the reason you turned out so well is that you were never able to be the dramatic one. You had to find another way. She meant it as praise. I received it as the full articulation of something I had been half understanding for years. I had turned out the way I turned out because there was no room for me to struggle. My stability was not a character trait. It was what was left after everything else in the family was accounted for. And my mother was complimenting me for it, which told me that she still did not see it, that to her, my smoothness was evidence of my resilience rather than evidence of what had been required of me. I said nothing. I helped clear the table. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for about 20 minutes. The second recognition happened when Camille called me in what was, for her, a bad period. She was not in crisis. She has good people around her and a treatment team she trusts, and she knows how to reach out when things are getting dangerous. But she was struggling, and she called me because I was her sister, and because I had always been steady, and because the steady one was safe to call. I picked up the phone. I listened. I said the right things. I stayed on the phone for an hour and a half, and when I hung up I noticed something I had not noticed before. I felt completely empty. Not tired, not taxed in the ordinary way. Emptied, as if something had been drawn out of me that I did not have the reserves to replace. And I noticed, sitting with that emptiness, that this was not a new feeling. That I had been feeling some version of this after almost every substantive interaction with my family for a long time. That the steadiness they relied on was costing something, and that the something was coming from a place that was not being replenished. I made the appointment with Dr. Okafor the following week. The first year of therapy was, in Dr. Okafor's words, an excavation. Not a pleasant one. The image she used was of a house that looks fine from the outside, well-maintained, no visible damage, and that turns out, when you begin the renovations, to have structural issues that have been developing for decades. You can live in the house. It functions. It holds up. But the problems are there, and not looking at them does not mean they are not there, and, at some point you have to open the walls. Opening the walls produced the following things, in no particular order. A level of chronic anxiety that I had been managing through control over my schedule, my diet, my environment, my relationships that was so habituated I had mistaken it for personality. I am a planner. I am organized. I am reliable. These are the words I had used. The more accurate words were, I am someone for whom unpredictability triggers a threat response that developed in a childhood where unpredictability was constant, and the only way to feel safe was to control the variables within reach. A difficulty asking for help that was so deeply embedded I had to trace it explicitly to understand where it came from. I do not ask for help. I do not ask for help because I learned at 12 that what I needed was less urgent than what was happening on the other side of the house, and I learned to be right about that by never testing whether anyone would show up if I asked. The not asking and the learning to manage alone, and the being called steady, they are the same thing, just described from different angles. A grief that surprised me when it surfaced. Not for Camille, or not only for Camille. For myself. For the 14-year-old in the kitchen who was told to wait. For the 17-year-old whose anxiety was called college stress. For the child who learned to make herself easy because being difficult would have used resources that were needed elsewhere. The grief for that child was the most unexpected thing in the first year of therapy and the most important. And underneath all of it, in the place I had the hardest time looking directly, the resentment. The thing I had said in the third session. The anger at my sister for being sick. I want to stay with the resentment because I think it is where the most useful part of this story lives. When I first said it to Dr. Okafor, I immediately began apologizing for it. I said, I know it's not fair. I know she didn't choose to be sick. I know she suffered, and I don't want to be someone who resents sick people. I said all of this very quickly, in the practiced way of someone who has been keeping a feeling quarantined for a long time, and is finally releasing it, but is also, simultaneously, trying to contain the release. Dr. Okafor said, We're going to come back to what's fair in a moment. First, I want you to notice that you apologized for having a feeling before you had fully finished having it. I said, yes. She said, that's very practiced. I said, it's been a long time. She said, tell me about the feeling before the apology. So I did. I told her about the anger. Not the general background anger I had been aware of for years, the one I had filed under stress and personality and sometimes just labeled as being tired. The specific anger. The anger at being 12 years old and losing my family to something I did not understand and could not compete with and could not fix. The anger at being told, in the language of comparison, that my needs were a smaller emergency than the one the family was already managing. The anger at performing steadiness for 20 years at a cost I was only now beginning to tabulate. The anger at my sister specifically, not for being sick, which I understood at the intellectual level she had not chosen, but for the specific experience of growing up alongside someone whose presence so dominated the family's emotional resources that I had been forced to become someone who did not need those resources. The anger at becoming the steady one when I had never been asked if that was who I wanted to be. Dr. Okafor said, that's a lot to carry. I said, I didn't know I was carrying it. She said, you were very good at not knowing. I said, I had practice. She said, what would you say to the child who learned to not know? I could not answer that for a long time. We spent several sessions in that territory before I could answer it without just crying, which I did anyway, but eventually also with words. What I would say to the child is, your needs were real. Your heaviness was real. Your anxiety was real. The scale that was used to measure them was not a fair scale. It had been calibrated by a crisis, and crises distort calibration, and no one thought to reset it when the crisis became chronic. None of that was your fault. And the steadiness you built was remarkable, and also not something anyone had the right to require of you. You were 12. You needed someone to ask how you were, and wait for the real answer. You deserved someone who waited. I told Camille I was in therapy about 4 months into it. Not the full contents of what I was working through, that came later and in pieces, but the fact of it. She was, as she often is in her stable periods, warm and engaged and genuinely pleased that I was getting support. She said she was glad. She said she had always thought I seemed like I was carrying things I did not talk about. I said I was working on that. I told her more of it, specifically the resentment, in a conversation that I had been preparing for with Dr. Okafor for about 6 months. Not because I needed Camille's permission to feel what I felt. Therapy had helped me understand that I did not, but because she is my sister and she deserved to know that the relationship we had was shaped by things I had been carrying, and because I believed, based on who she is, that she could hold it. She held it. She said, I've always known something was off. Between us, not in a bad way, but I could feel that you kept something back. I thought it was because you didn't trust me, because I was unstable. I said, it wasn't that. It was that I didn't know how to not manage you. I'd been managing the version of you that the family was scared of for so long that I'd forgotten you were also just my sister. She said, I am just your sister. I said, I know. I'm relearning that. She said, are you angry at me? I said, yes. Not at you being sick. At some specific things that I needed and didn't get because of how sick you were and how the family organized around it. And I know that's not your fault. I'm working on holding both of those at the same time. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I'm sorry. I said, you don't have to apologize for being sick. She said, I'm not apologizing for being sick. I'm apologizing for being the reason you didn't get what you needed. Those are different. I sat with that. She was right. They're different. We talked for 2 more hours. Some of it was the most honest conversation we have ever had. Some of it was painful in the way that honesty between people who love each other is painful. At the end, she said, I want you to be able to tell me things. When you're struggling, I want to be someone you can call. I said, I'm working on that. She said, I know I wasn't always safe to call. When I was bad, I mean. I said, no, you weren't. And I understood that mostly. She said, but you also needed someone to call. I said, yes. She said, I'm sorry that person wasn't there. The conversation with my parents happened in stages, which is the only way I have found these conversations to be manageable. My mother first in the spring. I told her I was in therapy and what I was working on. I told her specifically about the kitchen conversation when I was 14, about telling her I thought I was depressed and being told to wait. She did not remember it. I believe her. The years of Camille's early illness are a blur for her in the way that sustained crisis makes time blurry, and a single Tuesday afternoon conversation with the other daughter may not have registered with enough weight to be stored with precision. She said, I didn't know you were carrying that. I said, I know you didn't. She said, why didn't you say something more? I understood the question was genuine and not a deflection. I said, because every time I started to, the signal I got was that Camille's needs were more urgent. And I was 12, so I adjusted. And then I adjusted so well that I forgot I was adjusting. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I think we failed you. I said, I don't think you meant to. She said, that's not the same thing. She was right. It is not the same thing. She said, what do you need from me now? It was the first time in my life she had asked me that. Not what did Camille need from her, not what did the family need from her, not what needed to be handled or organized or managed. What did I need? I opened my mouth and nothing came out for a moment because I did not, immediately, know the answer, which was itself the answer, or part of it. I said, I need you to ask me that regularly, and wait for the real response. She said, I can do that. She has been doing it, imperfectly, in the way of someone learning a new practice at 62, but consistently. She calls every 2 weeks, and she asks and she waits. Sometimes I have something real to say. Sometimes I just say I am okay, and she accepts that without pressing but also without immediately pivoting to Camille's status, which was the old default. The change is small and enormous simultaneously. My father was harder, in a different way. He is a man who finds emotional conversations genuinely difficult, not as avoidance, but as a genuine limitation in the language available to him for that register. He heard what I said in the conversation we had in June with evident effort. He said he was sorry. He said he had not known what to do during those years and had dealt with that by doing what he could manage, which was the practical things. He said he had not understood what the rest of it was costing. He said, "You were always so capable." We leaned on that. I said, "I know. I'm working on being less easy to lean on." He said, "That doesn't sound like a bad thing to work on." I said, "I hope you'll be okay with a less capable seeming version of me sometimes." He said, and this surprised me, "I'll be relieved, frankly. It was a lot of weight to watch you carry. I just never knew how to say so." I looked at him. He had never said anything like that to me in my life. I said, "You could say so now." He said, "You carry too much. You always have. I'm sorry we let that be necessary." I did not know what to do with that, so I hugged him, which is not something we do often, and he held on longer than I expected. I want to tell you what 2 years of therapy has produced because I think the production is the point of the story. It has produced an understanding of anxiety that is specific rather than ambient. I can now often feel it coming in a way that lets me address it directly rather than through the controlling behaviors that were its old proxy. I cannot always do this. I am not fixed. But the understanding is there, and it is mine, and it is something I built by opening the walls of the house rather than repainting the exterior. It has produced a relationship with Camille that is more honest and more mutual than the one we had. She knows things about me that she did not know. I know things about her that I'd been filtering through the family's crisis language and had not been receiving clearly. We are sisters in a way that feels real rather than managed. She calls me when she struggles, and I do not immediately become her caretaker. I am her sister, present and honest, and I tell her when I have capacity and when I do not, and the world has not ended. It has produced a version of myself that asks for things sometimes. Not fluently, not without effort, but occasionally, and with the understanding that asking is not the imposition I was trained to believe it was. I asked a friend for help when I was sick last winter, and she brought soup and stayed for 2 hours, and I cried afterward. Not because I was sad, but because I had not understood, until the soup arrived, how hungry I had been for someone to just show up without being asked twice. It has produced the capacity to be angry at my sister without the anger consuming me, or being the final word on how I feel about her. Anger and love, it turns out, occupy the same space without canceling each other out. Dr. Okafor was right about that the first time she said it, and I have spent 2 years discovering it is true. And it has produced, most importantly, a retirement of the role. I am not the steady one anymore. I am Vivian, who is sometimes unsteady, who is sometimes anxious, who calls her sister back not because she has everything together, but because she loves her, and they're still learning how to do this. Who tells her parents when something is hard instead of filing it under manageable. Who is in therapy not as a crisis response, but as the regular maintenance of a self that took 34 years to understand was worth maintaining. Update. Posted 6 months after the original post. I promised myself I would not update this post unless I had something real to add, and I have something real to add. Camille and I went on a trip together last month. Just the two of us. 4 days in a city neither of us had been to, chosen because it was neutral territory, not associated with family or illness or any chapter of our shared history. We stayed in a small hotel. We walked a lot. We ate at places we found by wandering rather than planning. On the second day, she had a difficult morning. Not a crisis, nothing dangerous, nothing requiring intervention. Just a difficult morning, the kind that is part of life with her illness, that I have witnessed many times through the family crisis lens and that I received, this time, differently. I did not become the manager. I did not take over or make calls or begin organizing the day around her mood. I sat with her in the hotel room and I said, "What do you need right now?" And she said, "Just to sit here for a while." So we sat there. I read and she did whatever she needed to do with a difficult morning, and after about an hour, she said she was hungry, and we went and found breakfast. On the walk back she said, "You're different." I said, "I know." She said, "I like it. You seem more there." I said, "I used to be managing things instead of being there." She said, "Yeah." I could feel that. Even when it was helpful, I could feel it. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be. You were doing what you knew how to do." We walked for a while without talking. She said, "Can I tell you something?" I said yes. She said, "I used to feel guilty. That you were so steady, and I was so much. I thought you were steady because you were stronger than me, or because it came naturally to you, or because I had used up whatever was supposed to be yours. I didn't know they were the same thing." I said, "That it was costing me?" She said, "That you being the steady one and me being the crisis were the same system. That one created the other." I stopped walking. She stopped too. I said, "When did you figure that out?" She said, "When you told me about the kitchen, about being 14 and being told to wait. I thought about that for a long time, and I thought she was me. She was going through what I was going through, except no one was allowed to say so. And the reason no one was allowed to say so was because I was already going through it and there was only room for one of us." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry there was only room for one of us." I said, "I know it wasn't your doing." She said, "It still happened to you." I said, "Yes." We stood there for a moment on a sidewalk in a city neither of us had been to before. She said, "I'm glad you're not steady anymore." I said, "I'm still steady sometimes." She said, "But now it's because you choose to be. Not because there's no other option." I said, "Yes, that's exactly it." She linked her arm through mine, and we kept walking. That is the whole update. That conversation on the sidewalk is the update. The two of us finally, in the same system looking at it together instead of each of us being half of it. 2 years of therapy to get to a sidewalk in a city we had never been to. Worth it. Obviously, completely, without qualification, worth it.